Hello, everyone. Welcome, and thank you for joining us for this Ask the Expert session. We're going to be covering guiding data transformation with integrations inside of STEP. This is going to be the first installment of the Ask the Expert series. It's bringing together all the knowledge and experience of both the Amplifi and Comma teams. So it's definitely going to be a treat. I want to take the opportunity to talk a little bit and do a little bit of housekeeping. When you signed up for this webinar, you had the opportunity to submit questions. We're going to be answering some of those questions throughout this outline of events that we're going to be talking about. It's going to be in a style of a panel discussion. So there's going to be a lot of great things that we're going to be covering today. If you have a question throughout this webinar, you have the ability to submit that question at the bottom of the screen. And when we have a moment at the end of the presentation, we will get to those questions or we'll follow up via email afterwards because there is a lot to cover. So let me introduce you to our team of panelists. We have Chris Collier, who is the Chief Technology Officer here at Amplifi, and Jayesh Kondapuram, who is the Senior Solution Architect. Over across the pond here at Comma, there's Mike Evans, who's the Chief Technology Officer over there, and Catherine Cherry, the Senior Business Consultant. Guys, tell me why integration is so important.
So I'll jump in on this one since it's an easy question. So I think a lot of people would say, well, yeah, it's important. Two systems have to talk to each other. But I'll answer that in a little different of a way. So when we go into an organization and we look at taking the power of STEP and applying it to a business problem, we focus a lot on, okay, we can model the data to specifically fit their challenges. We can guide their users to their governance processes and validate that data to specifically meet those business challenges. So we're all walking in with a set of problems that is either going to drive revenue for the organization or reduce cost or risk or something. And STEP gives us this pure canvas to really construct that business solution, but it doesn't really have an impact on day-to-day operations a lot of the time, right? So like they're issuing orders out of their ERP systems, and their customers are coming to their website and then ordering, placing items in the shopping cart in their OMS system, and they're shipping out of the warehouse, which is binning by WMS. And so we're not necessarily affecting those operational systems. So that bridge for us is the integration. So we have faster data, we have more data, we have better data. We need to get it to the places that then it's going to be utilized to drive those very specific operations in the business lifecycle. So I think that's my easy answer of why we put so much weight on integration, even though it's kind of a boring technical thought. But would love to hear the Comma perspective there too.
Yeah, I think I'd just add to that we definitely get examples where clients invest so much in their master data management solution and they reach a level of maturity where they're managing their master data very well in STEP. They have data quality rules being enforced and data governance, but then failure to integrate STEP with other core systems across their organization leads to loss of so much of that value. So if you're still rekeying that data elsewhere, you kind of still get the data quality issues arising, and that can all be traced back to a lack of integration, because the benefits can only be realized if that data is being shared and not if it's being manually rekeyed elsewhere.
Okay, cool. So actually, they're looking at MDM as a single system solution sometimes versus an actual shift in their ecosystem.
Exactly, yeah. And ultimately, it's a failure to maintain that single version of the truth without that integration there.
Cool.
I think sometimes it's kind of not realized that a well-designed integration can not only kind of help you realize some of the value associated with your MDM, but also be an enabler for further change and for the business agility and to adapt to the market around you as well. It's not just a case of moving data from A to B. It's actually making you more agile as a business and being able to realize more benefit as you grow and move forward.
Oh, I think you're muted.
Dash, could you tell us more about what are integrations?
Absolutely. So, Mike and, Chris and Catherine have talked about why integrations are important. But from a conceptual level, if you're talking about data exchange between STEP and other systems, we can classify them into, two categories at the highest level: inbound and outbound. I'm considering from a STEP's perspective. So within this categorization, conceptually, there are many ways that STEP can interface with the other systems in your organization. So one of the ways, we can think of it is, push versus pull. So when I talk about push, what I mean is that, STEP is responsible for pushing the data once it's, ready. Now, so I call this like the Hollywood principle, don't call me, I will call you, because STEP knows, the life cycle of the data, as it pertains to STEP. And when the data is ready to be sent out, based on all the data governance workflows that you have defined, it can send the data out. It doesn't need, other systems, pestering it with requests for data. So most of the time, I would say this is the recommended approach. And as far as pull is concerned, that's an exact opposite. So external systems, they pull the data from STEP using the STEP's REST APIs. And sometimes, clients want to be in control of, when they want to receive the data. And so this is probably one situation where they would prefer to pull the data rather than, systems STEP pushing it to them. But again, there are use cases where a pull also makes sense. Another way of thinking STEP integrations is synchronous versus asynchronous. So STEP can make REST API calls to other systems synchronously to fetch data or update statuses. Like, for example, you are creating an object in STEP and you want to use maybe an ID generated in maybe an external ERP system. Or, you want to map an object in STEP with an object in other systems, because any object, that you think of in STEP, there are bits and pieces of it which are relevant to other systems. So STEP can make calls, synchronously to these other systems, retrieve their IDs and, put it in STEP. So this is where there is a gateway endpoint is a terminology which come into play, which can make these REST calls. And on the other hand, other systems can make, REST calls to STEP, because STEP itself provides a REST API, which other systems can use to interact, with the data in STEP synchronously. So as far as asynchronous data exchange goes, you can, set up data to be published on a schedule. So another, concept, when we're talking about data, integration is, and especially this is, more relevant in terms of data going out of STEP. So, like, how do you define, what data needs to be sent, from STEP? So there are a couple of ways you can think about this. First is a fixed data set. So you can send a defined data set irrespective of whether they have been, recently updated or not. So let's say you are managing data for about 1,000 products in STEP. Of those, let's say you sell about 500 products, on your website, and you want to refresh the data for these 500 products once a day at midnight. Right. So this way, what you can do is you can define a set with those 500 products, set up a schedule, and every night STEP can send the data for those products to your website. The other approach is Delta. So you only want to receive the data as and when it changes. So this is obviously a more efficient use of resources, both from a STEP's perspective, also from the receiving system's perspective, because you don't have to handle large data sets all the time. So we have seen a lot of integrations, and I would like to think like we are the farmers insurance of integrations, because any kind of integration that you can think of, we have seen it. So Chris, Mike, do you guys want to talk about some of the patterns that you have seen with our clients?
Yeah, do you want me to kick off with one? I think you've sort of talked about some of it there in when you were talking about the asynchronous use cases. But I think a question that I get asked quite a lot is, well, can I use my step instance to be, can I kind of make calls to that instance to retrieve data that I'm going to display on my website on demand? So can I have my website call step on demand when it needs to display some data and retrieve that data? And the very short answer is yes, of course you can, but there are lots of things that perhaps you think about as whether that's the right strategy for your organization. And some of those things are, well, how frequently are you going to be making these types of calls into the step application? How much data are you retrieving, and how complex is the data model that data is stored within? And do you need to be making calls 24/7, or is it only at certain times of day? Because all of those factors, that's going to affect how highly available you need your step instance to be, how performant you need your step instance to be. And I think Chris made a good point earlier around how often your MDM system isn't that system that's directly interacting with your sort of the transactional parts of your business, and the way you sort of scale and design your environments for your MDM system isn't always the same as you would an operational system that's going to be in high demand. So you have to really think about, well, do we want that sort of high demand access at hitting something like step, or is it a better strategy? And Jayesh, you talked about this as well, a better strategy to use that asynchronous push perhaps to a low latency, high availability database that then your sort of high frequency services can access that database rather than accessing step directly.
Yeah.
So yeah, that's certainly one that comes up a lot, and certainly one where there's always a lot of debate. I don't know, Chris, if you've got any to add to that.
No, yeah, and so I completely agree. Synchronous access out of step, it totally aligned with what Mike is saying. I think sometimes, though, if we flip that around, another pattern we see, and Jayesh briefed on this one a little bit, was synchronous access from step to another system, which a lot of the times we have this perspective of it's almost an integration because it's a system talking to another system. But really, we can almost see it like a business rule. And where this comes up, I like the example that Jayesh used for like a SKU assignment. A lot of the times we're working with customers, they have legacy systems that maybe they do material number assignment in their ERP. It's predicated based on a certain set of prefixes, based on categories and available numbers, based on a registration list. And they've baked in thousands of lines of code to how they generate IDs. And it's just not a feasible situation to move all that into Stibo, into the step platform on day one. Well, there's actually a really lightweight way that step can make an asynchronous call to somebody else through a business rule, which is what we would see in a workflow where you might hit a SKU assignment stage and you can author a business rule to connect to that system, get that data right locally. And so now you have your master data element referencing a different system of creation. So that's a pattern that we've seen on the flip side of that. Now, to the asynchronous stuff, Mike, I know you and I were jamming on this one and agreed. Your comment on the high available middleware and your focus on the importance of decoupling your systems. Can you give me that pattern? Just give me an overview of like why that is so important to flexibility.
Yeah, I think it's a really important point, because it's like it kind of goes to that point around how we actually design our integrations end to end, and not just thinking about, okay, well, what features have we got available in step? Right, I can use this to do that, but actually really looking at our integration strategy. And one thing that I've seen our clients be tempted to do sometimes is say, right, okay, well, I need to feed data from step to my ERP system, let's say. And so, right, okay, I can build an integration endpoint for that. And that integration endpoint can do some transformation, and it can transform the data into a format that my ERP system's going to be friendly to the ERP system. It's going to be able to ingest it. So I'll do that, and I'll get set to send that data onto the ERP. Well, that's great. That'll work brilliantly well for that ERP integration, assuming it's all designed correctly. But then perhaps later on, you're going to want to send the same data to another system, to your website maybe. And all of a sudden, you've got the same data. You're going to have to do a load of different transformations to get it into a format that your website can ingest. And actually, you don't need to keep sending that data out, the same data over and over again out of step. A better strategy would be to sort of send it out once and perhaps have your middleware orchestrate the different transformations to different downstream applications, and effectively decouple the two systems at the start and the end of the data flow. So if you were to replace any one of the components there, everything else still works, and you only have to sort of replace the interaction between the system that you're replacing and the middleware itself.
Yeah, and I think that concept of decoupling is a really important concept that we apply at a lot of our designs, because it really lets us take the concept of governance at an organization and elevate it outside of just like MDM rules and workflows and that kind of thing, and say, no, how is your organization going to evolve over time, and how do we support that? So we put the contracts in place, which might seem a little restrictive, but it's so that as you make new decisions, we can evolve along with you without having you going to have to make 6 releases on 6 systems that are all talking to each other just to have replaced one thing, which we've seen.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, as if we. Yeah, it's really crucial that whenever we design anything in the integration space, that we're always thinking about, well, how this is going to scale with the organization, but also how is the organization going to maintain this and look after it over time.
Yep. And then Catherine, you haven't weighed in on this one, so I want to hear from you on any patterns that you've run into that were pretty interesting from an integration perspective.
I guess one use case that we perhaps haven't touched on is where clients would benefit from integrating their PIM or MDM solution with the BPM tool.
Wait, what is a BPM?
So BPM or business process management technology is effectively technology that supports process automation and ultimately optimization. So processes such as the development of a new product, for example, you might want to manage that and track that end to end through a workflow, automating key handoffs between different teams, and providing visibility of the current status. So BPM is effectively acting as an intermediary between the different teams, but it can also connect between the different systems. And a lot of the activities involved, so if we take a product setup example, they might happen outside of your MDM or PIM solution, potentially in other systems. There's other activities such as capturing product imagery or calculating pricing, or quality approvals, things like that need to happen. But at certain key points in the process, the workflow progression, the process progression might depend on a status update or an event. For example, an approval or creation of some data within your PIM tool. So you can then integrate STEP with your BPM tool and allow those updates to sort of flow through without that need for manual interaction. And that allows the process to continue as efficiently as possible as well.
That's really cool. And then I think the only other use case which I'd want to come back on is something that Jesh and Mike both even talked about, which was the concept of a full refresh, which is a pattern we run into a lot, which we tend to try to avoid for the reasons of decoupling that Mike was mentioning. So whenever we run into the pattern of, okay, I want to do everything again at midnight, we try to look at, is there a way that we push you all of the changes and we'll use your middleware and you can feed them in one input to that system at midnight so that my business process isn't aware of your business process. So keeping things a little disconnected. So I think to Jayesh's point, if you've got a pattern, we've probably run across a customer that's done it or run away from it screaming. So we can give you that input.
It sounds like it. So, Jayesh, can you tell us how it's all done within STEP?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think one of the words that you might have frequently, heard, Chris and Mike and Catherine say is decoupling, right? We do not want tight coupling between systems, because that makes, if you ever need to change, any part of the system, it makes that entire process very, very painful. So the same concept, can be applied within, to the design of the integrations themselves in STEP. Because if you think about, integrations logically, it's like a pipeline. There are certain different pieces to that entire process, and each process, can be, or a module, right? So you do not want each of those modules to be very, very tightly coupled, because, if you thing is, there's a lot of changes happening in the organization. You might want to bring in a new middleware system, or you want to bring in a new way of handling data interchanges. So if you build the system very, very tightly coupled, it becomes really painful. So keeping that in mind, the integration architecture within STEP itself is very, very modular. So let me go through a couple of slides. Can you guys see my screen?
Yeah, I see it.
Yeah.
Great. So if you're talking about data coming inbound to STEP, right? So we can logically think of it as, where is my data coming from, right? Because we have these other systems, and these other systems might want to send their data to a message queue, or to an Amazon queuing service, or they might just want to extract a file and put it in a hot folder. So that is the receiver component of the inbound integration endpoint. Once you receive the file, because there is going to be some mismatch within the data structure of the source system versus the target system, it's always going to be the case. It is very impractical to assume that whatever data that is produced by one system will be easily consumed by another system. So should you want to transform the data to a format that STEP can understand, there is a capability in STEP to basically transform the data to a format that STEP can understand. Now, coming back to Mike's point, just because there is a capability, it doesn't mean you should always use it. You should always consider the pros and cons of each approach, because you could, in theory, do the same task, maybe in an ETL layer, in a middleware layer somewhere, right? Instead of having this responsibility within STEP. So that is something to consider, but it's always good to know that, this capability exists in STEP. So once, you have received the file and you have transformed it in a format that STEP can understand, you can, hand it over to STEP and say, okay, go deal with it. So this is where, the process engine comes into the picture. And the process engine is basically, you can, import data from any kind of, you can import irregular, text data, structured data. You can also import digital assets. You can connect to, if you have a GDSN, feed, you can connect to that. So this is where the actual magic happens. So once you have, once these modules are defined, then you can say, I want to establish this on a schedule, because even though you can do all of this on demand, or manually, you would ideally want to do this on a schedule. So this is where the scheduler module comes into the picture. So if you can think about this, each of these boxes, can be replaced. So if you switch from a JMS implementation, which is on-site, to an Amazon queuing service, you just have to replace the receiver. The rest of the pieces, assuming that everything else remains the same, they do not need to be touched. So if you think about this, this gives you a lot of flexibility in how you can design the integrations. So the same approach applies on the outbound side as well. So on the outbound side, like logically thinking, the first thing that you would think of when you're designing an outbound integration is, what is it that I'm trying to send, right? So first you define the data set. So like I initially said, there are two ways you can do this. So first is you define a static set of objects and say, I want to send this, every night, no matter whether something changes or not, just refresh these products and send it to my website. I want these refreshed overnight. Not the most advanced pattern, but there are use cases for such a thing. The other thing is, instead of choosing a static set of objects, you can say, I only want to send data which has been updated in Step, because Step has events based on the life cycle of the data. So it can capture those events and process them, and send the relevant data to the outside, to the external systems. Process engine, it does the same thing that we discussed on the import side. And again, if you inverse, what we talked about on the inbound integration endpoint, like we had a pre-processor there, now we have a post-processor here. So you can, transform the data to a format, that your source system your target system can understand and process. So again, just a caveat that there might be other places where this might be more. There might be other places where it's a good idea to do this, hand over this functionality, but this is there. And then once you have the file ready, you can deliver it to the target. So this is like the delivery plugin is basically like a equivalent of the receiver plugin on the inbound side. So again, you can deliver it to a JMS queue, an Amazon SQS queue, or in a hard folder. So you can pretty much there are a whole long list of plugins which are supported. And then obviously the last thing is the scheduler. So again, you can schedule these processes to run at however frequent you want them to run.
Yeah, and just a quick comment. So there's kind of a dotted line box on all of these with like system triggers. So frequently on the inbound, as soon as the data gets in the system, you're actually then kicking off a process to start a workflow or link an asset or create a child object automatically and put it in a workflow. So, and ditto on the way out. Different rules may be triggers to then cause this to happen. So something hit a status was ready for web and launch date was yesterday, and so we want to go ahead and trigger it for a push. So the full power of the governance framework and business rule and workflows and everything is available at both as trigger points in and out of these integrations.
Right. And we briefly talked about gateway endpoints, but again, this is not really an endpoint in the strict sense of the inbound integration endpoint and an outbound integration endpoint. But it does, provide an interface with, to make REST calls from Step to other systems. And the good thing about this is there is built-in support for Amazon S3 API, the Microsoft Azure API, and these are invoked from the business rules. So these are not strictly integrations, but these allow you to talk, interact with other systems. And then there is the Step REST API v2. So this is the latest and greatest REST API that Stibo has come out with. There is, it has a lot more functionality than, when compared to the previous REST API. It has JSON support. And then this is the API that will be supported going forward. So, if your use case, asks for it, you can use the REST API.
Yeah, Mike even had a story he was telling me last week where he wrote a business rule with the gateway endpoint to call the Step v2 REST API to get some functionality done because it was so robust.
I'm gonna slightly disown that one that somebody else wrote this.
Oh, okay.
This rule.
Please don't try this at home.
Certainly a pattern that we've seen where Step actually has called its own API effectively to invoke something. make a process happen.
Awesome. What's our next question, Tracy?
Oh, awesome. So when it comes to a lot of client projects, we have a lot of clients that need their system rescued. So what are like the gotchas, the uncommon things that we've had to handle in the process?
So I can kick this one off. So one common thing that I know can cause a lot of issues for integrations in STEP is the use of calculated attributes, and clients often rely on these to calculate. For example, I know we've got a hospitality client where they calculate quantities of ingredients in a recipe, but these quickly add up to much slower performance when it comes to integration with calculations, a lot of calculations every time the integration is triggered. And I know we've definitely seen other examples of this, haven't we, Mike?
Yeah, definitely. It's a really common one, and it's a difficult one because there's lots of good reasons why STEP calculations work the way they do, and maybe if I talk a little bit about how they work before I go into it in more detail. But basically when you specify a calculation in STEP, that calculation will only ever sort of calculate and display a result when perhaps you load a screen that's got the calculation on, or when you put the calculated attribute value into an integration endpoint and export that data. It'll call the calculation at the time of export. So that means STEP's working harder than it would be if it was just passing out a piece of data that was stored in the database. It's not actually stored in the database, it's calculated on the fly when it's pushed out. So obviously you can kind of extrapolate from that if you have lots and lots of calculations all running at the time of export, that's going to make the application do some harder work. And in the example that Catherine gave with hospitality, where there's lots of kind of bill of materials type products, so you've got plates of food or recipes that are made up from lots of ingredients of different quantities, and there's perhaps lots of properties of those recipes that are derived from the properties of the individual ingredients, such as costs, such as nutritional properties, such as allergens. You can see how the calculations could rack up. But if you're exporting sort of thousands of products, each with 10s, 20s, 30s of calculations on there, you can see how the processing mounts up as well. So we'd always kind of look to try and advise on an alternative strategy in those scenarios. Sometimes a valid question to ask is, well, does STEP actually need to push all of the derived values down? Can it just pass the sort of source values for the calculations, and can they be recalculated downstream? So that's one way that challenge can be kind of mitigated. Another could be looking at maybe a different strategy to producing the calculated attribute if you know that it's got to be sent downstream in an integration. So perhaps using an event processor to run the calculation asynchronously and save it to the database. Obviously, there's some challenges that you have to overcome to make sure you've always got the right calculated value at the right time and in the right place. But again, that can greatly speed up the time it takes to run exports. And I think especially, I think Chris mentioned the pattern of the full export before could be really, really helpful in those sort of high volume scenarios. So yeah, that's that one. I think there's probably a related one on that actually as well, and another hospitality one where we end up having to deal with lots of triggering in the endpoint. I don't know, Catherine, maybe you want to sort of give me a bit of a flavour of that.
Yeah, so I know that we've had scenarios where they've sort of even got into continuous loops with products triggering integrations on each other, and things taking a lot longer than maybe necessary, and just sort of getting into that loop, I guess.
Yeah, I mean it's one that I think as Jesh was describing all of the different sort of tools that we have available, I guess, in step to sort of facilitate building integrations, you realize what weird and wonderful creations you can almost come up with. And something that we see quite a lot, and the hospitality use case is another good one, where perhaps you have a calculated nutritional property, say, so you want to understand the salt content in a plate of food, and that's dependent on the salt content of the ingredients that are in that plate of food. So you have to be aware of when you make a change to the ingredients, and specifically the quantity of salt in the ingredients, that's going to have an impact on the recipe. So if you need that recipe to be kept up to date in a downstream application, you need to push the recipe out whenever you make a change to the ingredient, and that's where we might use event triggering to support that. But there's just quite a lot of watch outs with event triggering. You have to really think through the pattern that you're going to use. You have to try and be very efficient about only pushing dependent objects out when you really need to, and not taking like very sort of optimistic strategies that just say, right, well, I've made some change to my ingredient, so I'll push out everything that's related to it. You're soon going to be throwing huge volumes of data out by your outbound integration endpoints. And another one to watch out is where you've got lots of externally maintained attributes that trigger events on other objects, because rather than sort of making a load of changes and you have one approval with an internally maintained attribute, when you have lots of externally maintained attributes, each one will be treated like an approval, so you'll generate an event for each one, and if that has a triggered event, that could generate lots of triggered events for each one, and all of a sudden you're huge, and you've got clients asking you why there's 1 million events on the event queue and why it's taking a while for them to be processed.
All right, I got a couple, so I'll give you one. Kind of a design time gotcha that we've run into a lot is this concept of the delta feed. So Jayesh mentioned it earlier, and it's absolutely, we much prefer like the on-demand. So this is an event-driven integration. Something happened, a master data change occurred, the rest of the world needs to know about it. But when you kind of break that statement apart and you start looking like, okay, well, what happened? And so that's where we get into this gotcha of, a change occurred on an item, and it might have just been that the color changed, or it might have been that the status changed of the life cycle of the item, or it might be an entirely new item and you don't know anything about it, and I'm telling the world about it. And sometimes we end up in organizations where we get to the point where the business process externally may differ downstream in these operational systems based on what's happening in step. And there's this almost intuitive desire to map the integration to the downstream business process. And we start to try to develop 12 different integration mappings for one item getting an update. And it's if this happens, do this. If this happens, do this. Or sometimes it even gets down to the point where they just want to know the item, the field, and the change and the value that changed, and that's it. Or if two fields change, they want to know what those two values are. And Step provides a change indicator in its native format, Step XML. And even then, you could use that, parse the entire XML document and figure out what changed and consume that. We tend to hazard, at design time, we tend to hazard customers away from that because the model represented in the master data might not match the model downstream. So just an atomic, this tag contains a change might not actually be reflective of downstream business processes. So the philosophy we approach at design time to maintain decoupling and simplicity at the integration layer is to say that let Step manage telling you that something changed. And it might even tell you that it's new versus an update. But once we tell you that this is a new or this is an update, the expectation is really take it as a full record replace. So whatever your data is now, consider it invalid and consume this as the new data. We find that to be the most successful from a simplicity sake of the initial design time as well as maintenance. And then really where I've seen the strength of that is philosophically, it makes problems almost self-healing. So if you miss an item create message, and then an update comes along for a new item that you've never consumed, well, then you just create the record at that point. So it kind of makes things a little more self-healing. So I think that's a big design time gotcha we run into, and we probably spend a few hours in each engagement kind of going down that rabbit hole. And then I'll give you a cleanup to your question, Tracy, that we've come in behind and been like, and I've actually made the mess before and had to clean it up myself. Consideration for how many of these event-based integrations you're doing. So the rule of thumb I've always used is like 10 is kind of my ceiling. So I don't want to have more than 10 event-based integrations. If I do, then I want to figure out why, because I probably have a resolution issue, or I probably have some other constraint in my system. That, Mike's point of I have all these interconnected objects that are triggering their own integrations. And once you hit that 10, you start to impact the system itself. It has to process every minute. It's got to wake up and check 10 different queue tables and schedule 10 different outbound processes. And we might be doing too much in step that should be pushed off into the middleware platform. So I'd say, if you're looking at 10 or more, it might just be a time to say, okay, well, why do I have 10? Do they actually serve a process? Because step can handle it. It absolutely can. But then that's, we just want to make sure it's sized correctly at that point versus designed correctly on the integration side. But at least the beauty of, the beauty and the curse of integrations is a lot of the times we're able to identify these errors farther upstream. So most of the issues in integration, the gotchas, we're going to find very, very technically clear during UAT. But when they are issues in production, like I like the calculated attribute example Catherine gives, those can be critical issues because all of a sudden you're coming in on a feed that's taking 24 hours that's running daily, and we have to fix that yesterday.
You made a point that Chris, around when you're sending out calculated data again. So you talked about the change indicator there. That's another one. It's a bit of a trigger for me that's another sort of watch out, that often with your calculated information, obviously because of the way calculations are resolved, the calculation in steps eyes hasn't changed. So maybe the source values have changed. So when you push that information out, your change indicator isn't going to tell you that a calculated value has changed, because step doesn't store that value and it doesn't track the changes that have been made. And so then trying to interpret somehow downstream, okay, these were the various sources of that calculation and one of them's got to change, and therefore I need to treat this as having changed, can be really challenging. So that's another area where calculations can throw up a few questions, definitely.
Trust your master data.
And I think possibly, just adding on what Mike, you and Chris have already touched on, really, is thinking about the maintenance of your integrations as well, and things being clearly documented. And as soon as you sort of introduce complex business logic and you have lots of triggers and lots of events, it becomes much more difficult to support and maintain. And I think we've definitely seen that. And obviously some of the examples you've given already where we've had to come in and sort of rescue these projects would probably have benefited from a bit more of that and clarity in terms of what's actually happening and what's been designed and developed.
No, that's a great call out, because if one integration, I'm just thinking, is one integration is 3 different tabs with different tables within those tabs with different mappings inside those tables, and then all of a sudden you have 2, 3, 4 of those, and you're just looking at a file on the message queue saying, why did this end up this way? That's a really good call.
Yeah, totally. And I think that's a really key message for me with all of this, is like, we need to be thinking about an integration strategy that results in something that's maintainable and understandable and supportable. And I've certainly seen projects where, for lots of good reasons, there's been a, perhaps trying to get to a result quickly, to use a very agile approach to development, that, there's been a use case that needs solving, an integration use case, a solution's been built to do that. At the same time, someone else is building a different solution to address another integration use case, and so on and so on. And all of a sudden, there's no one overarching design that anyone can come in and understand and sort of say, right, this is happening here, this is happening here. I tend to sort of take a philosophy of like, try and do, from an integration perspective, try and make the step side as simple as absolutely possible. So, totally echoing Chris's point before about the numbers of sort of event-based endpoints. I try to go with one if I possibly can. Let's start with one and only go to two if someone really convinces me that there's no other way of doing it, or almost. So trying to make things that are maintainable, understandable, and that, you know, when we introduce new systems, new processes into an organization, as the organization changes, it's easy to adapt and flex to the organization's flexing.
Is there anything that like a business should definitely plan on the business side of things before even starting an implementation or an integration inside their STEP system?
So I think it's it's kind of twofold. So generally speaking, we're going to need the IT stakeholder for whoever owns that integration or the system we're integrating with. So we need that technical expertise, but we also really need the business function involved from whoever that other system is. And this kind of harkens back to something that Mike mentioned earlier, is we want to look at it, every integration as it's a piece of a solution. It's not just a technical requirement within the STEP world that we're solving. So I really think anytime we're integrating with a system, we want somebody who understands the technology that can represent the world of the possible within that organization, but then really who's going to be impacted by this and making sure they're part of that conversation. So, when we're looking at, when I look at the trigger in my system and I'm going to push data to you, implicitly there's some process that's going to happen over there. So we have to be aligned on what that is from a governance perspective, and vice versa for the incoming trigger. I expect a product that's being launched to be fed into, to my system for enrichment. We have to be clear on what that trigger is so that we don't compromise speed to market. So I think that holistic approach of what is our overall solution, what are we trying to achieve as a business, and making sure we have the right representatives for each of those groups is what I would say go in with that.
I definitely echo that, and I think maybe just to elaborate on that slightly more, I think one key point from my side is that imagine a lot of projects often start with an initial phase that's kind of a sort of rapid time to value. Some would call it a minimum viable product. There's lots of different terms for it, but where we want to get to an outcome quickly to prove the value of master data management, and that's a really good thing to do. But I would always encourage any organization trying to do that to first take a bit of a step back, look at what things you're trying to achieve in the longer term with your master data management platform and all of the things around that, and design your integrations, even your MVP integrations or whatever we want to call them, with that in mind. Don't be thinking about what's the quickest and easiest way to solve this problem, but think about, okay, what does this need to look like in the longer term, and let's build the first step on that journey towards that end vision.
Is there anything to consider as far as like maintenance and things like that?
I mean, there's certainly a lot to consider in terms of maintenance. I think my rule of thumb is that if you're if as a consultant, I can't give this to one of my colleagues and say, can you understand this? Can you tell me what it does? Then that's going to be really problematic in terms of maintenance. If we can't understand what we've built, then no one else is going to have a chance. So we really want to be making. I think it's choosing those features in STEP very, very carefully, and not just using stuff because it's there. So I think Jayesh, you mentioned some of the things like being able to write business rules as part of your inbound and outbound integrations. That's great, but it also opens up kind of infinite possibilities almost. And sometimes writing business rules is not needed, but it is one way of achieving a result. So you've really got to think about the different components that are available to you. Select the ones that are following a good and a correct design pattern, not the one that's the easiest route to kind of getting from A to B.
Awesome.
Does anyone have anything else to add? I mean, we've covered a lot here today. All right. no questions from the audience as well. I know we covered a lot of topics. Integrations sound like a blessing and a curse in some ways. Well, guys, you've heard it here. I mean, if it's happened or will happen inside of STEP, especially in regards of integrations, we could handle it based on this 1 hour of information. It's very clear that the combined 500 years worth of experience that Amplifi and Comma have between them is a force to be reckoned with. I mean, it's kind of amazing. Thank you guys so much for your time today. We'll be following it up with an email for the recording. It'll also be available on the goamplify.com website. And Mike, Catherine, Chris, and Jayesh, great job. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.